All right, folks. So today we're in for a little bit of a treat. We're going to talk a little bit about how we call certain radios beginners ham radios. And what I found out was it's an interesting phenomenon that certain people become upset or even enraged when we refer to a radio as a beginner's ham radio. Now, I want to talk a little bit about not just amateur radio or ham radio, but any hobby, service, activity that requires skill. Typically, you have somebody who starts off as a beginner or a novice. They move to intermediate and then to an advanced stage of understanding and skill. And ham radio is not unique in that fashion. Car racing, woodworking, art, anything is like that. And typically what beginners do in any of these activities is they start out with something that is a little less complex. It has less options. It has less configuration settings and is easier to understand basic concepts of that particular activity. It's a very normal thing to happen. So I don't understand why the same wouldn't be true for amateur or ham radio. But in this video, we're going to talk about 3 reasons that people get upset when we refer to radios as beginners ham radios. I became aware of this after getting some comments on a video that I did on beginner HF radios. And to be honest with you, I was just dumbfounded with the logic that some people use when talking about amateur radio or even beginner amateur radio. So let's get into it and start talking about it. So this radio is an example of something that is typically referred to by many hams, myself included, as a beginner's amateur radio or beginner's ham radio. And the reason is that it is simple from a settings or configuration standpoint. It's relatively inexpensive and it has a lot of features that aren't overly complicated to use. You would think that that makes a lot of sense. Well, some of these folks get upset at certain recommendations and they say those radios are junk, those radios are crap, those radios are no good, and those radios are going to break, wear out, not be covered by warranty, or have bad firmware. Well, some of that might be true. But also, when you have somebody who is starting out in a new activity, I'm hesitant to have them go for broke or break the bank trying to get into the activity. And so when I recommend a radio, I look for something that has a lot of value. So that isn't so much that it's cheap. That means that you get a lot of capability for the price. And this Xiegu meets that mark. Now, when I recommend this Xiegu, I don't recommend all Xiegus because some of them I feel don't meet that value mark. But that's why we talk about a radio and not a brand of radios, where some of these folks say, well, you only buy from ICOM, Yaesu, or Kenwood because you know that the radio is not junk and it's fine. And if you can't afford that radio, you shouldn't be a ham. So that is really the first barrier to entry I think that these hams put up is that radio is junk and you shouldn't buy it. The next thing is some of these hams will conflate me or anybody else referring to a radio as a beginner's ham radio or good for beginners as equating them as a beginner. And that's not what's happening. That's not the case at all. What you can see is that there'll be a very skilled, knowledgeable ham who's been a ham for a very long time using a radio like this Yaesu FT450D. This 450D is a fantastic radio. It has a lot of capabilities and you could get them relatively inexpensive. And that's what made them attractive to beginners. Now you'll have somebody who buys one of these and hones their skill over time and they continue to use it. Or maybe they picked one up on the used market because they've always wanted one and they use this radio. What we're saying when we call this a good radio for beginners or beginner's ham radio is that based off of the capabilities, based off of the price point, it's an attractive option for beginners and veteran hams alike who maybe like a little bit of a simpler, less complex, more frugal approach to amateur radio. It's not calling that person a beginner or a novice or questioning their skill. How somebody could think that is beyond me, but it happens. The third one is where people get upset referring to a radio as a beginner ham radio. This is a good example, this IC718, fine radio, nothing wrong with it. And you can get these on the used market, relatively inexpensive compared to modern hams, modern radios that have waterfalls and all these other USB sound cards and all this other stuff built into them. This is a nice, attractive approach to somebody off looking to do something simple and get into the hobby and perhaps pick up one used from their buddy or from a local club. And when they buy this radio, they're, you know, you're shelling out $500, $750, something like that. And then the thought that you might have to buy another radio scares people. It scares people so much that they don't want to tell hams this is a beginner ham radio, because when you become something other than a beginner, you're going to have to immediately buy another radio and upgrade. But I think we just saw an example too that experienced and seasoned hams will use radios that are classified as beginner ham radios. Just because something's good for a beginner doesn't mean it's only good for a beginner. And as you develop skill, you have to buy another radio that costs all this money, and you're going to go broke. Never-ending money pit. Now, what's true is you're going to buy a radio, and you're going to say, I wish my radio did this, regardless of whatever radio that you buy. And I always tell amateurs and beginning amateurs and prospective amateurs, your first radio is not going to be your last radio. You will buy another radio because you're going to learn, you're going to grow, and you're going to want something different. Maybe you're the rare snowflake that never wants anything different. You're going to keep that radio until the day you stop hamming and hang up your microphone. But maybe not. Maybe you are going to buy another radio. I don't see that as a reason or a deterrent to say, hey, somebody who's interested in getting into ham radio, here are radios that are good for beginners. In fact, all three of these reasons sound pretty stupid, if you ask me. I'd like to say thanks for watching, everybody. I truly appreciate it. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or recommendations, go ahead and post them below, and I'll do my best to respond. Take care.